Humanities. My name is David McCabe. I'm the Director of the Division of Arts and Humanities. Before we get to today's event, let me just say, first of all, it's good to see so many of you in here today. Towards the end of the semester, I know the pressure is really low, so this is a great turnout. I do want to put a quick plug in for next week's event, and especially any of you who are sort of loyal Tuesday afternoon Ho lecture room, Lawrence 105 folks should know. Next week's lecture will take place at Golden Auditorium in the Little Hall. The talk will be by Elizabeth Dunmore, who is the director of the Eurasian Museum, and she's going to be giving this fantastic talk titled something like The Future of the Museum, Here and Now, something like that. And that's a better space for her to make use of the more sophisticated technology we have down there. So that's next week at 4:15, not in this space down at Golden Auditorium. Today we will be hearing from our colleague Ian Helfant. I'm especially looking forward to this. I said to someone I thought Ian had kind of the coolest sounding title, Wolves and Russia and Predators and all those things. But to give Ian really a proper introduction, I'm going to ask my colleague Jessica Graybill, who is the director of the Russian Eurasian Studies here program here at Colgate, to say a few words. Jessica.
Well, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Ian Helfant this afternoon. Ian joined the Colgate faculty in 1998, coming to this institution from Harvard University, where he completed both his bachelor's degree and his doctorate. In the time he's been here at Colgate, Ian has been a stalwart member of first the Russian department and now the Russian Eurasian Studies program, as we've transitioned from one place to another on campus. Students in his courses always remember his smile and encouragement in learning this rather difficult language, so you can attest to that in the room, and to, of course, learn about the culture of this vast continent, Eurasian continent. I'm not sure if this is on, I just simply speak about it. Thank you so much. In addition to the energy he brings to the study of Russia, its language, literature, and cultures, Ian has become quite dedicated to the pursuit of environmental studies in his teaching and the pursuit of sustainability in his service endeavors also on his campus. These interests have led Ian to a joint appointment with Russian and Eurasian Studies and Environmental Studies, two realms of inquiry which few scholars worldwide have combined so eagerly, especially in recent years. As we will hear today, his passion for the environment shines through in his research as well. Ian's talk today, Wolves in the Imperial or Russian Imagination, has been several years in the thinking and writing. I should know, as I heard all about this topic 3 years ago when we co-led an extended study through Russia and Kazakhstan. Ian taught my ear off on this topic then. But enough from me. You are all here this afternoon to hear Ian speak about wolf hounding, the Humane Society, and the literary redemption of a feared predator. With such an enticing subtitle, as well as just the title, as David also mentioned, who can wait any longer? Ian, the floor is yours.
Make it a little bit darker up here so you can see these slides. I'm not really used to the lights in here. Is that good enough? Good? Okay. So Jessica, thank you very much, and David as well, thank you very much. I really can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be able to talk about this stuff. It's not that common, not that often in a scholar's life to get to talk to so many people about something that you're so interested in. Usually when people like Jessica and I go to conferences, we might have 10, we might have 15 people in the audience. And so it's just a real pleasure. I really appreciate you coming here. I'm going to turn on the microphone just to see is that better? Can you hear me better that way? Okay, that's good. So what I'm going to be talking about today is one of the chapters primarily of this book I've been working on. And Jessica was almost too kind. I've really been working on this for about 10 years now. And the book is going to be published, it's going to be printed in June. So it's been a long time coming. And what I'm going to do is basically set you up by giving an overview of the book and some of the scholarly underpinnings of the book, and then talk very, very briefly about the 3 chapters, the first 3 chapters, and then I'll focus on chapter 4. And some of you were at an Environmental Studies brown bag that I did back in October. That was on chapter 3, and because it was Environmental Studies, I focused on chapter 3, which was about rabies and Pasteur's invention of a rabies vaccine. Today's talk is much more sort of humanities-based and literature-based in terms of what I focus upon. So what I want you to be thinking about as I talk today is when you look at a painting like this, a bound wolf from 1891 by Alexei Danilovich Tishenko. What do you see, and how do you interpret what you see? You might say, well, it's very obvious. There is a large wolf. Hopefully you can tell it's a wolf lying on the ground. It's bound. Its mouth is bound. Its paws are bound. There are, looking down upon it, 2 Russian wolfhounds, Borzoi wolfhounds, and a man with a dagger standing beside it, looking down, talking to a woman who's clearly the upper classes. She's well dressed. We're not, you probably wonder, what are they talking about? Is she asking anything that might signify compassion for the wolf, or is she simply asking out of idle curiosity? So what I want to do is basically give you a sense for how you might begin to think about questions like that, looking at an image like that by this talk today. I'm sure I'm going to run out of time. There's just too much to say, but that's all right. There's a lot of overlap, and there are a lot of different things that I think will be useful. So the book itself draws upon 2 primary fields of thinking: eco-criticism and human-animal studies. And I'd like to show you a little bit from those fields that will help to anchor what we're going to talk about today. And I will read a couple quotes, not too many long quotes, but some that are important. So eco-criticism attempts to achieve a broad understanding of the subject by ranging widely through such diverse disciplines as history, anthropology, literature, journalism, the visual arts, and the natural sciences. The fundamental question that eco-criticism explores is how humanity views itself in relation to nature, and how these views vary between societies over time, particularly as expressed in literature and the arts. And by the way, any of you who were at the October Brown Bag, there's about 3 slides that are shared out of 18 or so. So if you're looking at this quote, and you're a scholar of eco-criticism, you might say, well, I disagree with that, because this is my quote. In other words, this is how I define eco-criticism. And that's one of the 2 central sort of scholarly strands that feeds into my thinking about this material that's in this book. And eco-criticism is a field of scholarly inquiry that really is rooted in the United States, and actually in the Western United States. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have international significance or sort of worldwide practitioners, but it does have many of its origins in the US, which is kind of a cool thing to think about. The other primary area that I will be drawing upon is human-animal studies. And you might say, well, why human-animal studies? Isn't it just called animal studies? Well, basically, most scholars such as myself who've begun to really push into this area feel that human-animal studies is kind of a more accurate way of defining the subject that we're investigating. After all, animals don't leave documents. Animals don't leave written records. And mostly what we're really looking at and analyzing is human attitudes toward animals. It's one of the interesting and yet frustrating things about what I do. How do you try to get at the ways that animals might have felt by humans? That's a different but related question. We'll talk about that as well. So human-animal studies shares this breadth of perspective, the breadth of eco-criticism, with particular attention to ethical and ecological implications of humanity's interrelations with other animals. A unifying theme of human-animal studies is that the ways in which humans view and portray other animals lend important insights not only into our interactions with and influences upon the natural world, but also into our conceptions of self and society. And again, that's my quote, it's not someone else's. So when you look at those 2 quotes there, the one that's kind of grayed out now about eco-criticism and human-animal studies, be thinking about how you might apply those to looking at wolves in sort of 19th century Russia. And by the way, I should mention that human-animal studies, it has a number of different sort of roots that fed into it. People will often mention thinkers like Peter Singer, who wrote Animal Liberation in 1975. And a thinker like that is someone who believes strongly that animals have rights and that humans tend not to respect those rights, that humans tend to mistreat animals. And many people who are drawn to this area of inquiry, such as myself, have a strong admixture of a desire to be more active than passive as scholars. And so that's an interesting thing that you may want to think about. It's hard to write about the ways that humans have treated wolves without getting, honestly very upset and very aggrieved and very really ashamed. And so one of the things that scholars such as myself have to kind of grapple with is how do you deal with that? Do you believe in being a dispassionate scholar, or do you believe that there is a place for passion and for shame and for things like that that scholars will often try to sort of not address directly? Human-animal scholars will often use the first person, for example, as will eco-critics. There's a sense of wanting to reflect upon one's situatedness in the world and sort of take responsibility for the source of one's attitudes and beliefs. So I thought it might be worth just showing again, and I think I mentioned this is the last slide that you may have also seen in October. This is a Russian book. It's a kind of a Russian folk print. You might see these hanging in inns or in various places you might frequent as a late 19th century Russian, particularly if you were a relatively simple person, frequenting taverns or inns. And if you look at it, most of you, of course, aren't from Russia or from late 19th century Russia. And you might think, well, what makes that look Russian? Well, you see the pine trees, you see snow, you see that sleigh being pulled by 3 horses, a troika. You see wolves. And those wolves may not look completely realistic to you. And what are they doing? Well, they're trying to get at those people inside the sleigh. So I've translated this as rapacious wolves falling upon travelers, and it's from 1894. And you see similar images throughout the 19th century. Sometimes when foreigners would write about Russia, they would talk about this situation of the solitary sleigh, the troika out going over the vast Russian plain over the snow, pursued by wolves, and therefore these Russians, they would write, would throw someone to the wolves, let's say a baby, or for that matter, a newlywed couple. There's very like with fairy tales, there's variations upon the theme. So I presented this to you as kind of a sort of a quintessential representation of some aspect of late 19th century Russian culture. Now, here I'll give you 3 slides to talk about the 3 chapters that precede the main focus for today, chapter 4. So, again, chapter 1, harnessing the domestic to confront wild borzoi wolf hunting and masculine aggression in Tolstoy's War and Peace. The publisher worked very hard on me to say, why don't you change your title to make sure you emphasize masculine aggression, and they eventually talked me into it. If you look at this picture from the 1870s by this artist Chekhovs, it's again a representation of a wolf that has been taken down by borzois, and there are several men who were mounted on horseback originally. So what Russians would do, it's a little bit like the English fox hunt that you're probably more familiar with, but different. They would pursue the wolves sort of in across whatever type of terrain they were in, and eventually they would close in on the wolf, and then the borzois would hold the wolf, just like you see there from the rear. And then the men would often jump right down onto the wolf, and they might stab it or they might bind it. Those were the 2 things that could sort of really distinguish you as a brave Russian male hunter. And as you can imagine, if you've ever seen representations of English fox hunting, this is not what English fox hunters did. They didn't jump down on the fox and start wrestling with it like that, right? So this is something kind of uniquely Russian. And I'm not giving you the quotes right here, but there are a number of quotes I've discovered from all through the 19th century in which Russians talk about this as kind of the ultimate test of Russian manhood, or one of the ultimate tests of Russian manhood. And so in this chapter, I look at the way that Lev Tolstoy, one of the most famous Russian authors, in his novel War and Peace, which is about 1,400 pages long, from the 1860s, he has a scene set during the Napoleonic Wars when Napoleon invaded Russia. And he has a scene set in 1810 in which one of his protagonists, Nikolai Rostov, a young count in his 20s at that point, goes on a wolf hunt. And it's about 20 pages of description by Tolstoy of Russian nature and the different types of hunting that Nikolai does, including this wolf hunt. And what originally caught my attention about it, aside from the fact that virtually no one has written anything, in my opinion, interesting or good about it, just little things, right, was that Tolstoy says that the instant when Nikolai saw this mature wolf in a ditch with his 100 hounds including borzoi and scenthounds swarming over the wolf. That was the happiest moment of Nikolai's life. And I thought, as I'm sure many readers have, wow, that was the happiest moment of his life. Why? Why was that the happiest? Didn't he feel any sense of compassion for the wolf? How should we think about that? It's a little bit like looking at some of these pictures or paintings, and you say, well, how should you interpret that? And it's similarly with that scene in which you have this literary character experiencing this moment of ecstasy, really. How should you think about that? And that's one. So that's a big focus of chapter 1. And what I do in this chapter is I situate that literary representation against a whole series of memoiristic portrayals of wolf hunting from throughout the century, and also actual manuals. How do you raise borzois? What should you feed them? What should you do when they get sick? And believe me, not very many people have looked at those. They're hard to find. The Russian is really difficult. Like how, what's the Russian word for the scruff, the hair on the back of the wolf's neck, and all these. It's a difficult type of vocabulary. And chapter 2 focuses upon Russian hunting societies. And there were a few different Russian hunting societies, of which 2 were paramount. One was called the Imperial Society for the Promotion of Game and Wildlife of Economic Significance and Proper Hunting. And that was the most important one. That was a society that was established in 1872, and they had a set of journals, and particularly one journal called Nature and Hunting. And they also actually ended up publishing a newspaper called Hunting News. And I literally read not every single article for their 30-year run, but basically I went through the entire set of 30 years, just looking to think what was interesting. And I took 3 trips to Russia in 2006, 2012, and 2014, and finally sort of narrowed it in each of those trips. But these hunting journals, and particularly Nature and Hunting, remained one of the primary sources that I used throughout my research. They have all kinds of different types of sources. There are sort of early zoology, early Russian zoology, natural history, memoirs of a hunter, memoirs of a reformed hunter who has renounced hunting because he's thought better of it, people writing about when they would see birds migrating at different times of the year, all different kinds of things. It's a very rich source of materials that very few people have looked at. And so I wanted to show you that this hunting society, and I don't know if you can see it well at all, but what you have here is you have Moscow in the center, surprise, surprise, and that's where the society was originally based. And then you have all these different branches. So even out in Siberia, they attempted to establish branches in the late 80s and the 90s. They established branches all the way down in Odessa, as far west as Warsaw, up in Petersburg. So you have a sense for this imperial society extending its reach in all these different directions. And they basically, along with other Russian hunting societies, attempted to gauge how many wolves existed in Russia, and essentially promoted campaigns of wolf extermination. And the Imperial Society in particular promoted the use of strychnine, which is a poison that acts upon wolves in a most sort of painful way, causes them to sort of throw up blood and then basically die. And this is a poison that was used in Western Europe and also in the U.S. The third chapter, and this is what I gave the talk on in the fall, focuses upon rabies. Many wolves in Russia, there were many reports in the Russian newspapers of wolves who carried rabies, sometimes attacking remote villages. There is one story, for example, which is not untypical, of a wolf running into a village in 1862 in Belarus, actually, and near Minsk, and attacking 62 people. And I talked about this in October, of whom only about 22 survived after being bitten by this rabid wolf. And so when you read an account like that, you have to think to yourself, is that true? Could one wolf, even if it were rabid, really attack so many people? So part of what I do in this chapter is look at stories like that and sort of trace the amount of reporting in newspapers about attacks by rabid wolves. And then finally focus upon a couple of stories by Chekhov and by Tolstoy's sister-in-law, Tatyana Kuzminskaya, which represent medical treatments of patients with rabies. particularly patients attacked by wolves. And Chekhov, who had recently graduated from medical school, had a certain set of perspectives upon emerging treatments for rabies. Both of these stories that I'm discussing are from 1886, and Pasteur had invented his rabies vaccine in 1885. And then Kuzminskaya, Tolstoy's sister-in-law, basically believed that folk healers were the best sort of solace for people who had been bitten by a rabid wolf, and she was very much against the sort of official medical establishment. And what the chapter ends on is the fact that 19 peasants in Smolensk were bitten by a rabid wolf, and they were sent off to be treated by Pasteur in 1886, in the spring of 1886, just shortly after he had proven that his vaccine worked. And they made a sensation in Paris. You know, these Russian peasants were visited by the Russian consul and treated very well by Pasteur. And it's a great story. And I'm lucky because actually my French cousin, was the director of the Pasteur Institute. And so I was able to get this picture of this photograph of these Russian peasants from her. She basically paved the way, which was very helpful. And it's really a cool picture. So now we get to this chapter that we're focusing upon for today. And I just want to give you kind of an overview. It's a very busy slide, and you don't have to look at everything. Essentially, I'll have kind of one slide for almost every one of these topics. But what you'll see is that we're going to look at, so you now have a sense from the earlier part of my talk about what a problem Russians perceived wolves to be. They were afraid of rabid wolves. They believed actually that wolves they knew that wolves often attacked their livestock. There were experts. For example, there's an 1876 brochure by this guy Lazarevsky. He was a government bureaucrat, and he essentially tabulated the damage that wolves did to Russia's peasantry and livestock. And he concluded that about 50 million rubles worth of damage was done each year by wolves attacking livestock. And he concluded that about 200,000 large livestock were killed by wolves each year, and up to 500,000 smaller animals like fowl that would be kept domestically. And whether he was accurate or not is a complete, interesting exploration that I talk about in that chapter. So, as you can see, Russians feared wolves. They thought that they were rapacious. They thought that they were predatory, which they are. They saw them as really the enemy. And in 1892, they promulgated a law which basically said predators like wolves can be killed by any means possible, including poison, and basically promoted the idea of predator eradication, of wolf eradication. So how is it that in this context, in the 1890s and early 20th century especially, some Russians began to think about wolves more empathetically, with some degree of sympathy? How could that happen? So that's what we're going to talk about now. Now, first of all, in 1865, the Russian Society for the Protection of Animals was created. I call it the Humane Society for short, or the RSPA. And I believe actually that may be the same year that the U.S. Humane Society was established. I'm not positive, but I think that's the case. And I'll talk about that society to get us started off in a sec. And what I will do after that is talk about one method that peasants used to kill wolves, which I think will horrify you. And then this institution that came into sort of being in the 19th century of what they called wolf hounding. It's a little bit analogous to the like bullfighting, if you try to think of something that you could relate it to in our modern world. Or perhaps dogfighting, which you've read about occasionally lately. What would happen is that hunters, particularly with dogs, would capture wolves alive, and then they would bind them, like you saw in that first picture, so you're starting to get more of the context for understanding that picture. And then they would keep them, usually captive. They would keep them captive for 3 weeks, a month, longer. Then they would release them in front of spectators who paid typically to be there. And they would release them with these boxes that would basically open on all sides. And this wolf suddenly would be exposed on all sides. And then they would release borzoi hounds at them. And they judged the borzois by how quickly and efficiently and ferociously they took down the wolves. And then typically they would try to save the wolves from actually being killed by the hounds, whose job was to hold them down. And then they would reuse the wolves. And it's really an astounding cultural institution that very few people really have written about. So it turns out that Chekhov, Anton Chekhov, not only wrote about wolves and rabies, but he wrote about this cultural institution of wolf hounding. So he has a story, which very few people know about, from 1882. It's actually a journalistic account. Chekhov worked his way through medical school by writing short accounts of what he saw around him. And so this is one example of that. You can't do that so easily anymore, if you're wondering, right? And I'll talk a little bit about how other people have perceived wolf hounding. And then basically shift into looking at 3 or 4 stories in which wolves are represented in literature, and the ways in which the authors try to grapple with how do you represent an animal's point of view? Do you put words into the animal's mouth? Do you have the animal speak? Do you have the animal think in quotes? Like we do, like we humans do? If you don't do that, or if you do that, how do you anthropomorphize the animal? To create empathy for the animal, must you think of the animal as human-like? So those are the kinds of questions that we'll look at. And finally, when you have situations which were repeated in which humans and animals, and particularly humans and wolves, look at each other and they exchange looks, how do people interpret that? And that's a whole other really dynamic area of human-animal studies at this point. And I realize I'm going long on my time, so believe me, I'm experienced enough, so I'll start cutting. I'll start shortening things when necessary. So don't be scared. I won't keep you here till 6 or anything like that. And we'll leave time for questions. So the Russian Society for the Protection of Animals. They were, as you might expect, sort of upper class. You didn't tend to get peasants, as you might expect, in a society like that. They were an example of sort of emerging civic society that you start to see in Russia in the 19th century, especially the second half. They especially emphasized protecting songbirds, who were often netted by peasant boys out in the countryside. They also believed that songbirds should not be kept in small cages. They tried to cut down on the selling of songbirds in the city. They also did, as in England, care about draft horses that were used to pull carts, etc. And they also cared about pets, as you might expect. And then to a lesser extent, but they also cared about livestock in general, cows, other animals that people use for their own purposes in agriculture. They also had a pretty strong religious underpinning to their thinking. They were, Russian Orthodoxy and sort of Russians' version of Christianity was a strong aspect of the Russian Humane Society, and you see that in their rhetoric. They did try to get along with hunters. They weren't against hunting per se, but they in 1873 they actually invited a group of hunters into their society. They said, "Why don't you form a branch within our Humane Society because you can help us to kind of get a sense for what's happening with hunting in Russia." Unfortunately, what happened is that these hunters actually started running wolf hounding competitions and other forms of animal baiting, and that created a rift, and essentially that relationship fell apart. The Humane Society was also very much against bear baiting, or sort of trained bears in general. Russians, you've heard about the Russian bear and sort of the importance of bears in Russian culture, and you would often see in the late 19th century bears out in the streets. These bears had often had their claws removed or their teeth removed, and they were not treated humanely in various senses. And the Humane Society actually managed to outlaw that practice in the late 1870s. Was one of the first successful things they did. And the other thing to emphasize about the Humane Society is they were concerned both about the suffering of animals, the actual suffering that animals underwent, but also about the effect upon people of seeing animals suffering. So, for example, they were against feeding live boa constrictors in front of spectators, which is just another thing they were against. Partly because they felt that it's not good, especially for children or for less educated people like peasants or working men, to see that kind of thing. They felt it had a kind of dehumanizing influence. And that's true of modern animal welfare organizations as well. They tend to have that twin concern for the animal and for the human spectator, participant. The Humane Society also had a succession of journals, such as In Defense of Animals, and they took part, they had both domestic conferences where they gave interesting papers about things like wolf hounding, and they also participated in the International Humane Society effort. So one of the first things that they really that they emphasized, in a really interesting article I came across, was this practice that had been used by the peasants of Novgorod from, they say, time immemorial, and it was still used in the late 19th century. And what would happen is that the peasants would identify the location of wolf dens during the summer. They'd hear the wolf pups yapping and howling, or the adult wolves howling. And they would send off some of their number to capture the pups, and they would tie the pups up, and they would take them to a river, and they'd have a round raft, and then they would nail the pups by their paws to the raft. And then they would set the round raft. It was round so that it wouldn't, come up against the shore and stop. It would keep on floating, at least ideally. And then the pups, you can imagine, were yelping and suffering. And the theory that the peasants had, according to the way this was represented, by people like Varonov, was that the adult wolves would hear the desperate shrieking of the pups and they would follow them away downriver, which of course wasn't very good for the communities downriver, but it was something that peasants did. And I've seen multiple reports of this. I'm citing the Varonov report, but I've seen it attested in other places too. So that's an example of where the Humane, and this report's from the Humane Society. It's an article that I found in the Humane Society Journal. So it shows you that there was this class component that when people who worked for the Humane Society thought about their country, they often associated the Russian peasantry with a particular form of barbarity that they were ashamed of and they felt had to be somehow dealt with, right? And so in Varonov's account, he says he describes his practice, and then he says, there is no argument that the wolf is a serious enemy and predator of domestic animals, but surely the important thing is that while tearing, let's say, a sheep into pieces, the wolf isn't acting consciously, not with a preconceived goal of inflicting harm upon humans, but instinctively for the satisfaction of his hunger. The human then, knowing this full well, instead of destroying the entire wolf family quickly with a salvo of shots, becomes a tormentor on a level with the unreasoning beast, subjecting him to a terrible death from hunger and the loss of blood. So you see there this concern that people who would do something like this would end up essentially becoming animal-like in the negative sense, becoming bestial, reducing themselves to the status of animals. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that, if you think about it, these wolf pups are kind of being crucified in a certain sense. They're being nailed through their paws and sent down the river. And it's just a very weird kind of parallel, to the idea of crucifixion. So the thing is that the Humane Society had a relatively easy target. I think most reasonable people would have seen that as something that was perhaps unnecessarily cruel, or at least many people would have. But the Humane Society had a kind of harder row to hoe when they started to deal with their own class. And the wolf hounding competitions that I've been describing, as you can imagine, those were promoted by the gentry, gentlemen hunters, upper-class hunters, people who could afford to keep a kennel of borzoi hounds and, feed them and go out on horseback. Obviously, it was an upper-class pursuit. So when the Humane Society wanted to kind of take wolf hounding to task, they were basically taking on members of mostly of their own class, and that's just kind of worth keeping in mind. So Chekhov, who wasn't precisely a gentleman, he was from a more sort of ordinary background. He, although of course he had gone to medical school, he in 1882 went to a wolf hounding, and it was at the Moscow racetrack, as I say, in 1882. And he describes it right at the outset of his sort of 4 or 5 page piece that virtually no one has written about as an anachronism in a European capital in late 19th century Russia. So he's very clear from the very outset of his piece that he doesn't agree with what's going on. And then he says, I will describe what I saw as kind of a ignorant bystander, not an expert. So he was differentiating himself from the accounts of wolf houndings that would appear in the hunters' journals and actually in the ordinary newspapers, in which people would describe the brilliant takedown exhibited by the Sheremetyev borzois, for example. These competitions were intended to test the borzois' abilities. So Chekhov says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to describe it like an ordinary person might see it. And he emphasizes that among the spectators, there are many women and there are many school-age children. And he, from the outset of his piece, he says this seems problematic to him. And then he says that he describes 2 wolves being killed, and they're both let loose from these crates, as I described, and very quickly taken down by the borzoi hounds. And then he describes, and this I'm going to read, he gives you a longer description of a third wolf. And, you can see in this quote that his empathy for the wolf is just so evident. The third crate is exposed. The wolf sits and doesn't stir from the spot. They crack a whip in front of his muzzle. Finally, he stands up as if exhausted, broken down, barely dragging his hind legs along. He looks around. There's no salvation. Нет спасения. But he wants to live so. He wants to live as strongly as those who sit in the gallery listening to the gnashing of his teeth and looking at the blood. He tries to run, but that's not in the cards. The Svietchen dogs snatch hold of his fur. The borzoi handler plunges a dagger right into his heart, and Vae victis, woe to the vanquished. The wolf falls, carrying with him to the grave a poor opinion of man. No joking, humanity has disgraced itself before wolves in contriving this quasi-hunt. It's another matter to hunt in the steppe, in the forest, where humans' bloodthirstiness can be excused by the possibility of an equal struggle, where the wolf can defend itself, run. So again, Chekhov, like many members of the Humane Society, is not necessarily entirely against hunting, but he's against this form of animal abuse, as he would describe it. So let's just switch to this slide. And this is a very interesting guy. He was a collaborator of the famous Lev Tolstoy, whom I talked about a little while ago. His name was Vladimir Chetkov. And he met Tolstoy when he was 29 and Tolstoy was in his mid-50s. And they became quite close very quickly. And he actually ended up kind of insinuating himself into Tolstoy's confidence and becoming the editor of his collected works, but also he became one of the primary movers of this intermediary publishing house. So after Tolstoy's spiritual crisis of about 1880, Chertkov basically helped to promote works written by Tolstoy and others that were very directly moralistic and that were intended to inculcate proper moral sensibilities in Russia's, especially, for example, peasant population. And Chertkov is not so much known for his own work. He's much more known as Tolstoy's collaborator and editor. But he did write this very interesting article that, again, virtually no one has written about, that I came across in a Russian newspaper called A New Time, Новое время, from 1890. And the article is about 3,000 words long. And Chetkov mentions that he was a hunter. He says he spent much of his early life hunting. He was a passionate hunter. But one day, he was on a wolf hunt. Once, standing at the edge of a forest during a drive, I got a wolf with a shot and ran up to him to finish him off with a thick stick kept for that purpose. I beat him on the bridge of the nose, the most tender spot on the wolf's body, while the wolf stared at me straight in the eyes with savage rage and gave a deep sigh with each blow. Soon his paws began to twitch convulsively. His limbs stretched out. A light trembling ran through them, and they grew stiff. So he did this, and he writes about it in the first person. And he then talks about the fact that that night he was lying in bed and he began to think about what he had done that day. And by the way, he had corresponded with Tolstoy. Tolstoy had read this and actually edited quite vigorously, and I have their correspondence, vigorously edited this 3,000-word article. It's very possible that Tolstoy wrote part of it. It's impossible to know. We don't have enough information. But Tolstoy was directly involved. And I have the sort of letters to prove that. And also Tolstoy wrote a preface for it. And he said to the readers, he said to Chertkov, I think if I write a preface, you'll have wider, your article will get wider recognition. Well, that was definitely true. And in the preface, Tolstoy said, he gives the story of an older hunter talking to a younger hunter and saying, it's wrong, a reformed hunter, an older hunter who's given up hunting, talking to a younger guy. And he says, it's wrong to kill animals for amusement and not out of necessity. And Tolstoy says, this is so indisputable and clear, everyone must admit that this is true. And he says, and I hope this article will help you to understand that. And then we get to Chertkov's piece, right? So we have that quote that I already read. And then that night, in a very Tolstoyan kind of vein, Chertkov is lying in bed. Recollecting this beating, I realized that I was taking real pleasure in the suffering of the creatures that expired. I felt ashamed of myself. At that moment, I realized suddenly, not with my mind, but with my heart, that this murder of the wolf was in and of itself an immoral act. That even worse than the act was the enjoyment I took in it. And that worst of all was that lack of principle with which I justified it. And as you can imagine, Chertkov's article created quite a fuss. The hunting community responded very, very defensively. And two of the guys that I didn't even mention, Sabanev, the zoologist, and then this legal expert, Turkin, one or the other of them, I'm not positive which, because it was unsigned, wrote an editorial saying, remember, 200 people are killed and eaten by wolves every year in the Russian Empire. Remember, we are all afraid of rabid wolves. Hunting is justified, particularly hunting for wolves. And so, and then there were, this sort of arguments about the validity of Chekhov's hypothesis had quite a currency and was talked about for months in the press. So now, what I'm going to do is relatively efficiently just give you a sense for the type of literature that was being produced by people about wolves. Some of it's by well-known authors. There's even another quick story by Chekhov, and others by very unknown authors. For example, this author, A.L. I'm pretty good at trying to track things down, but I have not been able to figure out who this may have been. If anyone can tell me, I'm all ears. So this appeared in Nature and Hunting. So it's a story about a wolf, the life and adventures of one wolf, that appeared in 1892 in a hunting journal. So it's a journal written and consumed by hunters. And it seems to have been written, if I had to guess, A.L. was a hunter. There's so much realistic detail in the story. And a lot of it involves how do you hunt wolves? And what are the different techniques? And, how many wolves might you kill if you unleash your borzois in a forest? And there's 10 wolves in there. And yet, the story is extremely empathetic in its portrayal of its wolf protagonist. It describes his puppyhood. It describes how he gradually graduated from eating squirrels and frogs and, things like that, insects, to eating domestic livestock that would be brought to him by his aunts and uncles and mother and father. And it's very anthropomorphic, really, in its way of portraying the wolf. And also begins to actually give you certain quotes. So you decide, do you think this quote is awkward? Does it seem like it's an attempt to capture the wolf's perspective, right? Something's not right, noted the dark one, directing his nose in all directions and sniffing the air. Carrion never smells at all in the frost, right? Now you can imagine a wolf, a real wolf, knowing that something was amiss if it was approaching a dead animal that had been laced with strychnine, right? But is this the right way to represent it? Be thinking about that. It's interesting, right? And then later on, the wolf is attacked. It lives actually quite a few years, but it's hunted. It becomes the object of desire for all the hunters in the area. And it's wounded at one point. And it has a mate, the golden one. Grief overcame the golden one as she saw her handsome one mutilated. Oh, damned people, crippling animals for fun. So if this seems a little bit awkward to you, I wouldn't be surprised. It seems a little bit awkward to me in some ways, and yet I see what the author's trying to do. And then at the very end, finally the wolf is killed. Basically, a number of different hunting parties all pursue it simultaneously, and it's shot. It begins to starve because it's been shot through the jaw. It's a terrible ending. What an amazing amount, and this is the narrator, what an amazing amount of shrewdness, life force, and energy perished with him. Yes, he was one of the most impressive examples of wolf kind. And you, pitiful and cruel people, you were able to vanquish him only in his tormented, maimed, and half-alive state. It's pretty clear whose side the narrator's sympathies are on, right? Even though this seems to be a reformed hunter. Then Chekhov himself, I'll be really quick about this story, returned to the theme of wolves in the one story, apparently, that he wrote for children called White Brow. It was solicited for this journal that was for children by the editor of that journal. And Chekhov describes this very old mother wolf. She's kind of broken down from age, but she has pups, and she wants to provide for the pups. And she sets off on a very cold March night to look for food. The old she-wolf was in poor health and weary. She recoiled from the slightest noise and worried the whole time about her cubs being harmed by someone in her absence. The scent of traces of humans and horses' stumps, the piled-up firewood, and the dark, dung-strewn road frightened her. It seemed to her that beyond the trees in the dark, people were standing, and dogs were howling somewhere beyond the forest. So not wolves howling, but dogs howling, right? It's like a complete reversal. Clearly, Chekhov's narrator is empathizing and portraying this wolf sympathetically. She's worried. She's hunting out of maternal instincts. She's afraid. She's vulnerable. Her senses don't work very well. So what happens is this old female wolf she does end up trying to steal a lamb. So you can think, what do you think about that? She gets in through the roof of the shed of this kind of isolated cabin. And she grabs this warm thing that she finds. It's dark, so she can't see very well, and her eyes aren't very good. Well, it turns out, then she runs off with it, this warm thing in her mouth. It turns out she's grabbed a puppy. And so she gets, a mile, it's not quite clear how long, away, and she drops it and begins to eat it. And suddenly she realizes it's not a lamb, but it's a puppy. And the puppy kind of licks her, and its back is bruised, but it seems very, sweet and unoffensive, and it's not a lamb. There are many stories, by the way, in Russian history of wolves eating dogs. So there's something odd about the fact that this wolf doesn't just decide to eat the puppy because she's starving, and her pups need food. So she brings him, the puppy follows her back to her den, where she has her cubs, or pups, you can call them either. I'll eat him now, the she-wolf decided. But then as she approaches the pup to eat him, she just can't get herself to do it. In the past, she'd eaten dog, but the puppy smelled very doggy. And with her poor health, she could no longer stand the smell. She felt disgusted and moved straight away. So it's not that she explicitly feels empathy or compassion or something like that, a human-like emotion, right? Or you decide, is it human-like? It's more that it's just distasteful to her. So it's this weird modulation on Chekhov's part. And then in the end of the story, basically the puppy, she goes back to try to get an actual lamb, and the puppy follows her back, and she still won't eat the puppy. And basically the puppy disrupts any chance she has of making a successful, capture of a lamb. And that's basically the story. It's a pretty short story. Then this is a very powerful, very brief 4-page story that I came across from 1902. As you can see, they're in chronological sequence by this writer, Zaitsev. It's a very beautiful narrative. So Zaitsev was born in 1881, lived in 1972, and he was a playwright, a dramatist, and also writer of prose. And he was of gentry background. And he describes in this story a pack of wolves that's out in the Russian barren countryside, like the steppe. There are endless fields. It's snowing. There's a blizzard. The wolves are being shot at by some unseen hunters who are shooting at them accurately and killing some and wounding others. And the wolves have nothing that they can do except for kind of cower and wander and hide in bushes. Their howling, exhausted in anguish, crept over the fields and froze within a verst, that's a kilometer, or half more, and didn't have enough force to fly upward to the heavens and echo in a shriek about cold, wounds, and hunger. So the wolves try to figure out what can they do. And like the previous authors we've seen, Zaitsev has to decide how is he going to represent the wolf's perspective. Is he going to anthropomorphize them? Is he going to give them speech? What's he going to do? And so this is what happens. The old wolf, there's a leader, says, "Comrades," said the old wolf, "all around us are fields that are enormous. There's no way to get out of them quickly. Do you really think I'll lead you and myself to doom? It's true. I don't know exactly where we should go, but who does know?" So this is very elaborate. It's a wolf, with a full paragraph, speaking, in very articulate terms. It does seem incredibly bizarre and odd. But the thing is that Zaitsev's narrative is so sort of poetic and symbolic. It's almost as if his narrator is kind of interpreting for us. He somehow almost gets away with it in a way that's really interesting. But the old wolf leader does not get away with it because the other members of the pack close in on him. They don't agree with his stance. Dozens of teeth, all just as sharp and burning as the first, bit into him, rended, tore out his insides, and ripped off pieces of fur. The malice and anguish that had snuck forth from these ragged and thin bodies hung over this vengeance in a choking cloud, and even the wind couldn't drive it away. So Zaitsev describes this pack of wolves almost like a rolling ball of teeth and eyes and tails rolling across this blizzard-swept landscape. It's very powerful. It's really very poetic. And at the same time, it's not sympathetic to the wolves in the same way that, for example, Chekhov was. We all felt, I'm assuming, if there was someone who didn't feel bad for the mother wolf, then I just don't know what to say. But these wolves, they're desperate, they're emaciated, they're starving. It's a different type of situation. It's very realistic, and yet, of course, poetic. So this is the last story. And by the way, in terms of peer review, so I sent in my book manuscript, and one of the readers was incredibly helpful. And he said, "I will not forgive you," he literally said, "if you do not include this story by Zinoviev Anibal,
He didn't say, I will not forgive. He said, it will be unforgivable. So I thought I'd better read that story. And I had somehow managed to miss it, even though one of my dear colleagues translated. This does happen, even to everyone. At least it almost happened to me. Thank God he saved me. And so I found this story, and it's like so powerful. It's written by this very relatively unknown writer to us in the West. She was married to one of the great Russian symbolists, and she published a poem called The Tragic Menagerie, the year of her death in 1907. And it was pretty much neglected throughout much of the Soviet period, and then has really regained attention, especially since it's now been translated into English. And by the way, of all the things I've been reading too, I think every single other one is my translation, and this is from Jane Koslow, my dear colleague who translated this particular story. Now, the story is part of a cycle, and the narrator is a young girl. It's a little bit unclear, maybe 11 or 12, kind of on the verge of adolescence. And she writes in the first person. And she's very smart. And she's very empathetic. But she's also very confused. And she's conflicted. And so she is living in her country estate. It's kind of pseudo-autobiographical. So it's based clearly upon Zinavieva Annibal's life background, but it's not really about her. She has this kind of pseudo-autobiographical young girl narrator. And this young girl is at her family's country estate, and the Tsar's hunt, as they call it, the hunt of the Tsar, comes to their village. And what they're about is, as their chief huntsman explains, is they want to capture wolves in the forest, and they want to bring them back to Petersburg for a wolf hounding. And you know what a wolf hounding is now, right? So Vera, the narrator, originally is very first of all, she develops a crush on the chief huntsman. And so that's mostly what she's interested in at first. But she nevertheless picks up the details of what he describes, which is we're going to go out into the forest, we're going to have dogs, we're going to have 100 beaters, and we're going to set up nets between the trees. And when a wolf runs into the net, the wolf will become entangled and another net will fall. And then what we'll do is we'll pin the wolf down with this pronged instrument that will hold its neck to the ground. Then we'll bind the wolf, like you saw in that picture. Then we'll break one of the wolf's legs so that it can't fight back too hard and can't run away when we use it in the wolf hounding competition. And by the way, that's the only reference to that idea that I've ever come across, the idea of breaking one of the wolf's legs. So I don't know whether that was kind of a fictional creation on the author's part to elicit sympathy. I'm not quite sure. I haven't come across any single other reference to it. So what happens is that the hunt commences, and Vera's family goes to see it, and they drive there in their carriage, and they're on the edge of the forest. And she's, meanwhile, in her own head, she's fantasizing about herself as a young princess who needs to save her people that she rules from the rabid wolves that are surrounding them. So she has this elaborate, really rich fantasy life. But then reality intrudes because she sees the first of the captured wolves being carried past her on these poles. So their paws are around the poles and they're being carried past. And then they're put into these carriages that have iron bars. And she says, I feel sorry for the wolves. That repulsive, slippery, flabby feeling comes creeping into my chest. I shove it away. Wolves are evil. They eat sheep. They ate my donkey. Wolves are evil and disgusting cowards. They attack loners in packs. What nasty eyes. The little eyes watch with evil horror like little coals. Of course, like searing little coals. At night, they glow like little green lanterns, wolf eyes do. So you probably don't necessarily sense this, but in that quote of this young female narrator, there's all these kind of cultural patterns, the ways in which wolves' eyes were represented. Peasants typically would see wolves' eyes as luminous. There's this whole theory of the gaze that looks back, centuries into classical times and talks about the idea of creatures like wolves or dragons having eyes that somehow transfix you, that shoot out rays that can get you, the evil eye, right? So all of that is embedded in this quote. Then she goes up to one of the gates, and this is like a super powerful quote, and she looks through the bars, and there's this wolf right there, right? But I've had a good look, and I've long since been crying. This wolf has been poked through the side with a rake. He breathes through a hole in his side. The air hisses, and it seems as though I hear it through the hole. The edges of his wound move up and down. It's horrible. The wolf's teeth have bit the stick in his mouth quite close to my face. Where it's pressed against the bars are his eyes. In their corners I see the white part is all bloody. His pupils strain straight into my pupils. Unbearable pain, furious hatred, and sorrow are condensed in them, along with a final, hopeless, settled horror. So she meets the wolf's eyes, and just like Chekhov did, but differently, right? and she feels this incredible sense of suffering. Zinovьeva Annibal doesn't put the wolf's thoughts into words. It's a different type of empathy. It's a different type of representation of the wolf's consciousness, right? And this is my last slide. So when you think about literary accounts like this and about this history and sort of the background and the antipathy toward wolves, the cultural antipathy, and the law of 1892 that targeted wolves and the use of strychnine, and then you think about the Humane Society and the people who began to think about wolves differently, like the amazing Chekhov. And then you think about an incredible writer like Zinovьeva Annibal, who's really been neglected, and her amazing female protagonist, narrator, right? You really begin to see how it's possible for a culture to begin to reconfigure its sense of an animal that has been so central to the way that it sees itself and that other cultures see it. And so when you think about this, the writers who tried to grapple with this, they really had their work cut out for them because they were dealing with a culture that had this antipathy toward wolves. And they were dealing with these incredible challenges of how do you represent animals' perspectives, challenges that modern writers haven't conquered either. And so there's a 2015 book by this really smart scholar, Catherine Ehrlich, which is called Talking Animals in Children's Fiction. And when I came across that, I was awesomely psyched because she actually quotes this very famous Russian scholar Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin, whom I have worked on, and he's brilliant. And she says that Bakhtin's theory of dialogism, the idea that when we engage verbally with each other, we are uttering things and other people are perceiving our utterances. He has this very elaborate theory of the way in which what we say is perceived and responded to. And she applies that to animals. And she says that when an author puts human language into the mouth or the mind of an animal in the ways that you've been seeing, the different ways that you've been seeing, that creates a kind of ethical, moral relationship between us, the readers, and the animal protagonists, right? Or for that matter, narrators. That because they have this human-like attribute of language, we somehow enter into kind of an ethical engagement with them. So that's one thing that's just kind of interesting that you might think about, right? And then secondly, I'm obviously just going over this very quickly, there's this issue of the gaze. How do you think about the way that we look at animals and the way that animals look at us? And it's incredibly, I guess I just really like this stuff. There's this incredible set of scholars who've written about the animal gaze. One of the highest end and most difficult to understand is, Jacques Derrida, who writes, he's getting dressed, and he sees his house cat looking at him. And he feels kind of odd because he's like naked and the cat's looking at him. And he then goes into this 130-page discussion of how to interpret that encounter, citing many, I forget if he cites 5 languages or 8 languages. It's very heady stuff, right? So I read that. But what's interesting is that Derrida says that the thing that this really questions for us is subjecthood and objecthood. And why do we think of animals as objects that we can do with what we will? Why don't we grant them subjecthood? And how do we think about that? And what would it mean if we did grant them subjecthood? So that's interesting. That relates a little bit to that whole Peter Singer, that activist idea of thinking about animals. I'm almost done. And then there's also a 1977 classic article called Why Look at Animals by this guy John Berger. I don't know if some of you read it. And Berger argues that, it's only about 20 pages if you want a quick read. He argues that we modern humans in societies like ours, post-industrial societies, right? Or in societies that have gone through the Industrial Revolution, let's say, that we no longer have sort of natural ways of interacting with animals and looking at them and returning their gaze. We're divorced from that direct connection. We rely upon factory farms for our animals, for example. And he says that mostly where we encounter animals, we encounter our pets, like Derrida can attest, right? Or we encounter animals in zoos. And that's a very weird kind of exchange of gaze, right? It's very different. It's very artificial. And that, in a nutshell, is part of what Berger says. And then, to my great delight, I came across this 2011 essay called The Gaze of Animals by this guy, Philip Armstrong. And he touches upon Derrida and Berger and all these other thinkers who've written about it in a really brilliant way. And he basically talks about the history of the ways in which humans have represented animals or perceive their gaze, I should say. And that's where, for example, I originally came across that idea of the evil eye and of dragons and wolves casting their gaze onto you in a way that could directly affect you, right? And he talks about the way that in the 19th century, in folklore and even literary romanticism, that idea of an active gaze that you could grapple with directly, that could affect you directly, continued to be present. But at the same time, new epistemologies of the way in which humans look upon animals kind of came to the fore. And so we came to the point where we think of the gaze as it's us looking at the animals. We are observing the object. And we think of ourselves as empowered. We have guns. We have laboratories. We have factory farms. We have ways of making animals our own. And it's incredibly powerful and disturbing stuff, but it's part of how I try to grapple with some of the instances that I've been presenting to you. And then, you've probably already read it while I've been talking, but I do want to just read this one famous quote. The quote you come across 20 times if you've been studying what I study, by Aldo Leopold, one of the founders of ecology, of modern ecological thinking, and of things like the land ethic. And I know all of you environmental studies students will have likely encountered him at some point. And Leopold describes from his Sand County Almanac in his essay Thinking Like a Mountain from 1949, this moment at which he had shot a wolf. He was participating in America's predator eradication campaigns. And he says, "We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then and full of triggerage. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would be in hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither wolf nor mountain agreed with such a view." So Leopold anchors a kind of epiphany, and remember Chekhov, right? An epiphany in this moment of interlocked gaze. And there are people who argue that it wasn't really so quick, that in fact Leopold's development of a land ethic and of sort of more modern ecological thinking took place over decades. But he himself, in representing it, chose to use this moment and to represent it as kind of an epiphany that took place like this. So it's actually almost literary in that sense. And I think that if, in my book, and I didn't tell you all the instances, but there are probably a dozen times where the human gaze interlocks with that of the wolf. It's this motif that you see over and over and over again. So in the conclusion of the book, what I do is kind of balance off this very famous quote by Leopold and compare it to all those instances of gaze in Russian history to kind of talk about similarities and differences. And I think I better stop there because that was, you're probably ready for me to stop. So, and it'd be great to have some questions. So, and if anyone does need to leave, I know some of my students told me they had to, so that's totally fine. But it'd be awesome if some of you stayed for questions too. So, Jess, how do you want to do it? Do you want me to field them, or what do you want to do? Yeah, sure.
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to. Does anyone have a question?
I can stare them down.
I'll stare them down. Yes.
I don't have a question, but if you haven't read it, Willa Cather's My Antonia.
Yes.
It's a wonderful episode where two farm hands have been ostracized from Russia because they failed to protect a wedding party as sleigh drivers in the snow when the wolves were chasing them. It's a wonderful scene, and I'm wondering what she might have read of Russian literature that she incorporated this story in her Western tale or Midwestern tale.
That's so kind of you to mention that. And I'm ashamed to say that another colleague mentioned that to me, I think it might have been 7 years ago. And I've been so focused on mostly Russian accounts, aside from Leopold, right, that it keeps on being the thing I mean to get to. And now there's no excuse because you brought it up again. So as you can see, I can't give you an answer as far as what Catherine had written. But I think it's very interesting. Clearly foreign perceptions of Russia often focused upon this idea of wolves in the 19th century in a way that we've kind of lost sight of, except for someone like Catherine, let's say, right? And wolves were very much part of the way that foreigners perceived Russia. They really were. And it was sometimes it was hunters. Like, I've heard this story that I haven't exactly proven. I've heard that Teddy Roosevelt, the president, that he went wolf hunting in Russia. And I've been trying to track that down, but I just haven't quite made it there. So Russia really had this reputation as a place where wolves could be found. Sasha, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't help doing some Marxist analysis of your characters, and it seems that you mostly talk about aristocracy and intelligentsia, maybe lower, middle, urban classes who watch those things, but all those people are safe, basically, or well armed. Now, my question, to which I will get after pontificating for a minute, my question is, weren't there some not only economic but also legal constraints on peasants owning firearms? They mostly couldn't afford them, but I think they also were not allowed to, prohibited by law. So in effect, peasants who owe 80% of the population and lived in the countryside, so they had a more direct relationship to were actually defenseless against wolves. And of course, if a pack of wolves destroys a horse, that's the big chunk out of the livelihood. Now, the only peasants in your story were those cruel peasants who did horrible things, and I was puzzled by the phrase there. It said something like, instead of destroying them with a salvo of shots, peasants didn't have shots or salvos, and so that's my puzzlement. Is it true that there were legal constraints on peasants owning firearms, and what did they do to fight wolves?
I really appreciate that question, Sasha. And so there's two parts to the answer. Let me deal with the first part. So my best understanding is that peasants were not forbidden from owning firearms. I've actually corresponded with a Russian scholar who is working in Germany currently. And she and I corresponded about that very point. And she said, and this is her area, and she said, no, peasants were legally allowed to own firearms. And then she said, just go look at the Code of Laws. And I have looked at the Code of Laws. I haven't found that one paragraph, but she, the expert, said peasants were allowed to own firearms. And of course, there are many instances in which you see peasants who own firearms, both in Russian literature and in memoiristic accounts. One of the things that Russian hunters would often point out is that hunting, or people who write about hunting in Russia in the 19th century, is that hunting was very, well, not exactly democratic, that would be putting it too strongly, but it was available to a wide swath of the population. And so in the days after the emancipation of 1861, for example, peasant communes had the ability to either lease out some of their land to, for example, hunting clubs that could then hunt there, or they could make use of that land themselves. So my very best understanding is that peasants were not prohibited from owning firearms, but rather it was simply too expensive for them. Then, of course, you also have, and I focus my book primarily upon Russia west of the Urals, because really that's what people have focused upon in terms of at least the way that I'm approaching it, in terms of Russia's wolves. Although, of course, there were many wolves in Siberia, but the conflicts between wolves and people and wolves and agriculture that people tended to write about were mostly west of the Urals. In Siberia, you do have a lot of indigenous people, and actually a lot of hunting law, because I had read quite a bit of Russian hunting law, talks about needing to respect the rights of, let's say, various indigenous peoples, or for that matter, simply peasants who relied upon hunting as part of their livelihood. Sometimes peasants would hunt with guns, and sometimes they would hunt with traps or use traps. So that's my best answer to that part of your question. The part where I actually feel more, sort of not vulnerable, but which I have bemoaned myself is, I kind of made a decision at some point working in this book that I was going to focus the chapters in the way that I did, and you have a sense for that now, right? And I would really like to have had, or maybe will subsequently pursue, write an article, let's say, on peasant perspectives on wolves, because you're exactly right. They were the ones who were vulnerable, and their perspectives are invaluable. But I essentially, for pragmatic reasons, partly because of my previous work has focused upon the gentry, as you know, I felt that I could make the book work well, and I think I did in the terms that I chose to approach it. Interestingly enough, the only other person who's written extensively like a book about Russia's wolves is this guy whom I, as you can probably tell, don't like very much. He's a retired, as far as I can tell, you can't quite tell, but he appears to be like a retired U.S. intelligence officer or Air Force officer of some kind. His name is Robert Graves, it's not a secret, and he's written a book called Anxiety Through the Ages, Wolves in Russia, and there's about 10 pages in that book on the 19th century, and everything else is post-revolution. But it's not a scholarly book. It's messy. It doesn't. He has direct quotes that aren't footnoted. It's just terrible. And not only that, but he's, I want to say, rabidly anti-wolf. And I really tear him apart in my book. I'm not like that. I don't normally do that, but this guy really had it in for. But in his defense, or to his credit, he does actually include a list of Russian folk proverbs about wolves that takes maybe 15 or 20 pages at the end of his book, but they're all in translation. He doesn't give you any sourcing, as is typical. So there is material to work with, and your point is very well taken. You're absolutely right, to kind of interrogate me about that. And I'd love to follow up with you, because I would, really like to maybe write a different article about that aspect. I would really love to get a question from a student. There's got to be one of my students here who could ask a question. I know you can ask questions, but who wants to ask a question? Yeah. Glynis.
You talk about the hounding of the wolves, and when they would actually have specters in those situations. Where was the divergence of how they looked at these dogs that could bite and could take on a wolf in such a violent way versus the wolf that they would now weakened. So these dogs, they kept those dogs kind of in containers as well, or were they very much pets?
Yes, that's a really good question, Glenn. So, borzois, you're all too, it sounds ridiculous to say, but some of my colleagues might remember these Smirnoff vodka commercials. I think they used to be able to show them on TV. Is that right? Do you remember what I'm talking about? And they'd always have Russian wolfhounds, because it's part of the way that they showed them. And they would, you typically see them, it'd be the Russian royalty, and they're wolfhounds, and then Smirnoff vodka, for example. And so it's a funny way to kind of segue from what you asked, but borzois were considered to be pets as well as hunting dogs, and they were kept typically by the aristocracy or the sort of the gentry of certain means, and they were considered to be very safe around the members of the family. Dostoevsky actually has a terrible story from Brothers Karamazov, his 800-page novel from about 1880, in which the two of the Karamazov brothers are talking, and Ivan Karamazov is trying to get his brother Alyosha, who's very sweet and good, to agree that certain things are unforgivable and should be punishable by, let's say, execution. And so he tells him the story of this Russian general from 1800 who has a borzoi hound, or actually has many borzoi hounds, and one of his peasant boys throws a rock and hits the paw of the borzoi. And according to the way that Ivan tells this story, which Dostoevsky got from this journal called Russian Antiquity, the Old Age of Russia, according to the way that Ivan tells it, the general sicks his entire pack upon the boy in front of the boy's mother, and the boy gets torn apart. And the actual original upon which this was based doesn't really make that explicit. It's not quite clear. But I actually talk about that in my book. It's this weird transfiguration of the idea of borzois protecting people. So Dostoevsky takes that and flips it in a really interesting way. Did that answer your question or not, Glennis?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so they could be kept in the house. They could also be kept simply as hunting dogs.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
seems like they seem to have the same might as a wolf, yet
Yeah.
they don't, a dog, a wolf, they're kind of the same vibe of animal.
You are so right. I mean, their names were Ripper, Shredder, Beast, Demon. Seriously. I mean, I'm just giving you some examples of actual names. I'm not making them up. And those were the names of the borzois. And often those names would be names that could be used for a wolf. So they're quality. It's bizarre. They are, this guy, Gary Morvan. He's a scholar of the foxhound, the fox hunt in England. He's a real prolific human-animal scholar. And he writes about the foxhound and says that English foxhounds are basically cultural, they're cultural creations. They are kind of a way in which the English aristocracy chose to engage with nature with a lot of pomp and circumstance and in a very codified manner. And so when you look at a foxhound, you should think of it as kind of partly culture. It's part of culture. It's not just, it's domesticated and it's part of culture, but of course it's used for hunting. And that way of thinking is kind of really interesting when you think about wolf borzois as well, because they exist in Russia to this day. And has anyone ever seen like a borzoi? Yeah, Leah. Where did you see it?
Dog shows.
Dog shows, yeah. Do you remember how big they are? Yeah, they're huge, right? Yeah. The thing is that hunters would unleash them. So a hunter would be standing there usually on a horse with the borzois, and then the wolf would come out from the forest. And then the hunters would, it's almost like the way that the Russians used to unleash hawks or falcons. You had to see the borzoi, they're a sight animal. They don't use scent, they use sight. So literally you have to kind of point them at the wolf and then unleash them at it. Like you'd throw a falcon. Not that I have ever thrown a falcon. And then the borzois were incredibly fast, and they would run, and they would, not hopefully, but the idea was that they would overtake the wolf and then take it down and give the hunters time to catch up. Typically, it was very unusual that a single borzoi could take down a wolf, and borzois who could do that became famous, like literally famous. And so people would write about them. And actually in Tolstoy's War and Peace, Nikolai looks at his borzoi and he says, Tolstoy says, the borzoi was known far and wide because it had once alone taken down a seasoned wolf, So I know we've been going on a long time, so you can either ask no more questions, or if you want to ask another question, that's totally fine.
I just have, I don't know, a question, but you talk about the gaze between the human and animal, and I was just wondering, have you ever been able to gaze into a wolf's eyes?
Yeah, right. So you may not know this, but there's actually a wolf sanctuary. Did you know this?
Yes.
Not far from here? Yeah.
Holly?
Yeah, that's right. And so it's about 20 minutes drive. So if anyone's interested, you can go there. And Will, the guy who runs it, he is really into wolves, as you might expect. And he has 50 acres, and then he has an 8-acre enclosure with last time I was there, about maybe 7 wolves. And he does his best to take care of them. Actually, I have participated in the deer cull in Hamilton, and I brought one of the deer over there for his wolf a couple of years ago, which he was really psyched about, because they usually eat chicken. And so now they got a deer, which, they were happy with that. So we've been there, and he has, anyone who's interested, he'll do like wolf howling, where he howls and gets the wolves to howl back, at certain times a year. And there you can gaze right into a wolf. But it's a little bit like John Berger's saying, it's an artificial thing. They're behind, a gate. They're behind a fence. Yeah. Any last questions? You've been really amazing. And you do not have to feel bad if you're all done. It's totally fine. And I will stay here if anyone has individual questions. So you're good? Okay, thank you very much.